Poor Henry Selick. Everyone thinks he's Tim Burton. And if you didn't know this before, I'm about to blow your mind. You ready for this? This movie was not directed by Tim Burton. It was produced by him, but the one who always seems to be overlooked in its creation is Henry Selick. Which is weird, because Selick is one of the biggest names in the game when it comes to stop-motion animation. Along with Nightmare, he's previously directed movies like James and the Giant Peach and the film adaptation of the classic Neil Gaiman story, Coraline. So any of you who are traumatized by the horrific ending of Coraline, this is the guy to send your hate mail to. Please don't actually send Henry Selick any hate mail, though. But yes, today, we're talking Coraline. Specifically, we're gonna be talking about the mysterious and duplicitous other mother of our heroine. Because there lies elsewhere in pop culture another famous creature that people have started to suspect may have had more involvement in Coraline than we thought. What's up, everyone? I'm Jacob with Channel Frederator, and today we're going to examine the possibility that the unsettlingly creepy monster from Coraline could in fact be the same species of creature as the clown that launched 1,000 shaky cam YouTube videos from Stephen King's It. And of course, if you don't want any more spoilers for Coraline or It, you might be best off staying in your own dimension for now. Okay, first let's get semantics out of the way. Most of what we're talking about is pretty much the same whether we're talking about the book or the movie version of Coraline, so for our purposes we're gonna be sticking with the film adaptation. Also, the film is a cartoon and yeah. And as for names, since neither of these monsters seem to have actual names and are only ever alluded to, we're gonna refer to the monster from Coraline as the Beldam, and we're gonna refer to the monster from It as Pennywise because that just makes things way easier for us. Otherwise, this entire video is gonna sound like a subpar version of that Abbott and Costello Who's on First sketch.
I don't even know what I'm talking about!
Alright, with all that out of the way, on one hand we have a monster that doesn't have a whole lot of history for us to go on. And on the other hand, we have a monster that's been adapted so much that getting a handle on its story is an undertaking all its own. So let's start with why people made this connection in the first place. What are the apparent similarities between the Beldam and Pennywise? And let's start with Pennywise. It's an extra-dimensional being of unknowable power that returns after a rather large time interval, the actual number of years depends on which version you're enjoying, with the ultimate goal of preying on children, which usually culminates in a huge disaster, like the Dairymain Ironworks explosion. So far, so wholesome. The way Pennywise goes about this is terrorizing his victims to emotionally traumatize them, flooding them with fear before straight up eating them. Later, towards the end of the story, Pennywise's true form is revealed, which turns out to be some sort of giant spider creature? Okay, sure. Well, what about the Beldam? Okay, so she's an extra-dimensional being of unknowable power that seems to appear after a sizable time interval to prey on children. So far, so pretty much the same. But the way the Beldam goes about this, instead of just taking multiple victims, is that she carefully selects her prey one at a time, meticulously crafting an alternate world to their victims' liking in an effort to seduce them away from their current miserable life. But why would she go through all that effort instead of just killing them? I hear you cry. Well, much like Pennywise, it's to feed off the victim's emotions, but not fear. For the Beldam, it's love and affection. I mean, at least until she gets bored of her victim and then leaves them to die and turn into horrible ghost children who I'm sure are super nice, but seriously, these three are creepy, yo. Oh, and I almost forgot, near the end of the movie, when she, like Pennywise, becomes more unhinged, her true form appears when she shapeshifts into a giant spider creature. Okay, that is a lot of check marks that both of these monsters have. That is a suspicious amount of check marks. And that's not even mentioning that both of these monsters are defeated by the refusal of providing them with the emotion that they're sustained by. Coraline refuses to give love to anyone but her true parents, just as the kids, and then later adults, in It defeat Pennywise by abandoning fear. Now, at this point, if you're unfamiliar with Stephen King's body of work, I should probably mention that a lot of his works have a sort of soft continuity to them, and they kinda sorta share a universe. And much of this is made clear in his Dark Tower series. Now there's way more to unpack here than we could ever hope to do in one episode of Cartoon Conspiracy. But for today, it's worth noting that there are creatures in this universe that seem to have similar skills to Pennywise. Like Joe Collins in the Dark Tower, who turns out to be a creature who feeds off of laughter and comedy, even able to cause people to die laughing. It's not exactly a one-to-one comparison to Pennywise, since Joe is a much more minor character and he was formerly human, but it does set the precedent for other emotion-feeding creatures like Pennywise to exist in this expanded Stephen King universe. But it doesn't really get us anywhere when trying to prove that the Beldam is the same species. Other than the suspicious amount of similarities between the two, is there anything we can draw from? Earlier we mentioned that both of these creatures depend on human emotion in some form or another, but this similarity that the theory proposes is actually pretty simplified. Here is the more detailed version. Firstly, Pennywise doesn't need to kill children specifically. It only does this because children's fears are easier to manipulate and manifest. And that makes sense. I mean, I guess it would be easier to shapeshift into something like a werewolf instead of an entire wedding reception where you have to give the best man speech. See, adult fears are too abstract. A werewolf is way easier. Also, Pennywise eats its victims, devouring the physical body, and while its spiritual component consumes its victims' fear, fear isn't totally necessary for Pennywise to survive. In the book, it compares fear to seasoning. It describes terrorizing its young, impressionable victims as akin to salting the meat, which just makes Pennywise even more of a dingle. Not only does he eat these kids, but he's also mean to them. Jeez, and he looked so nice just staring at me menacingly from the sewer. And the last point to hit with Pennywise is that his true form isn't actually a spider. Its true form would probably cause anyone who saw it to go mad since it's so beyond the realm of human understanding. Though, that said, it is the truest form that we're ever privy to, so whatever, it counts in our book. The beldam, on the other hand, doesn't appear to necessarily eat her prey. Or at the very least, it's left ambiguous in the film based on what the ghost children and the cat tell Coraline.
Mothers don't eat daughters.
I don't know. How do you taste?
But more importantly, the beldam does appear to be sustained by her dependency on love and affection, which firstly we can see by the fact that the beldam never actually tries to kill Coraline until Coraline raises the stakes. And secondly, toward the end of the film, as Coraline escapes, the beldam shouts that she would die without Coraline. Speaking in hyperbole? Maybe, but still worth taking note of, especially since without Coraline, both the world she created and herself appear to be deteriorating. And there's one other major factor that's usually brought up when discussing the beldam and Pennywise. Or rather, two major factors. And those are the mysterious cat voiced by Keith David in the film adaptation of Coraline, and the other is Maturin.
What's a Maturin?
I'm glad you asked, voice that was definitely you and not me under an audio filter. Maturin, or possibly Maturin, is one of the 12 guardians of the beams that hold up the Dark Tower in King's Dark Tower series. However, not only does he make an appearance in the original novel of It, but he also seems to have a tense adversarial relationship with Pennywise. Where Pennywise is a force of destruction, Maturin is a force of creation. He's also a giant turtle, but don't worry about it, that part's not really that important. The more important part is that along with being a creature that's generally depicted as kind-hearted, Maturin is much more of an omnipotent, ethereal presence than the cat seems to be. In It, it's implied that he was more or less manipulating fate from behind the scenes, only interfering directly on one occasion to tell one of the kids how to defeat Pennywise. Compare this to the cat from Coraline. He, like Maturin and the beldam, appears to be an interdimensional creature able to occupy both parallel worlds. And he's also weirdly chill about it.
If you're the same cat, how can you talk?
I just can.
He maintains an adversarial relationship with the beldam.
She hates cats and tries to keep me out. But she can't, of course.
And he doesn't seem to be one for direct intervention, only helping Coraline when she absolutely needs it, or when she throws him into the beldam's face, but I don't think he was planning that. In any case, these additional parallels between the two stories seem to strengthen our theory that the beldam and Pennywise are the same species. But then the question remains, could the cat be the same species as Maturin? Or do you think that the cat might have just been a conduit for Maturin? I'll leave that one to you to hash out in the comments. So right now we've got a big jumble of similarities and differences and parallels, and now my head hurts. And since a definitive connection between the two through pure lore seems unlikely at best, maybe there's somewhere else we can turn to when trying to determine if Pennywise and the beldam are the same species. With theories like this, a good place to look is usually towards the possibility of a real-world connection. After all, Coraline was published 16 years after It, so one must have inspired the other, right? Well, as it turns out, along with the fact that Neil Gaiman and Stephen King don't really have any sort of working relationship, Neil Gaiman's been very open in the past about what his inspirations for Coraline were. And of course, it has nothing to do with the supernatural world of Stephen King. In fact, it all stemmed from when his young daughter Holly would tell him stories while he was writing, and for some reason these stories all seemed to deal with Holly's mother being replaced by an evil witch. From there, the story would become an adventure wherein Holly would have to find her real mother, and that sound you hear is the crushing disappointment of a 4-year-old child being more imaginative than all of us. An important thing to note, though, is that these two stories are both perfect examples of the dark fantasy genre of literature. Though the phrase perfect example here is kinda contradictory, since the genre of dark fantasy is so vaguely named that it's kinda difficult to define. But one of the fathers of the genre, Charles L. Grant, is said to have described it as a type of horror story in which humanity is threatened by forces beyond human understanding. He also used the term to distance the genre from horror itself, which he viewed as something more visceral, a sentiment that King has also weighed in on, viewing horror as a more visual, primal experience, while things like terror are much more psychological. But as Grant said, dark fantasy stories, like Coraline and It, are often described in incorporating supernatural elements beyond human comprehension. And King's stories are full of this. I mean, King's stories are full of everything because he's written like 10,000 books, but even in what we've discussed today, this should be apparent. And as it's the basis for this entire episode, Coraline is pretty similar to King's most well-known piece of dark fantasy. As for explaining the specifics like the spider forms, well, spiders are a pretty common fear in humans. It's not unbelievable to think that two different authors would dip into that. Hell, Terry Pratchett's Discworld is also carried on the back of a giant turtle. There's precedent for everything. So even with all of these similarities, you could reasonably say that there is no connection. It's all one big random happenstance thanks to the dark fantasy genre. But some of you might be unsatisfied with us just being like, it's unconnected, it's all just similar tropes. Which is totally reasonable because it's not a very satisfying answer. So I've got one more for you. While we may not be able to definitively prove that the beldam is the same species as Pennywise, there is another creature that she might be. Some have proposed in the past, namely the YouTube channel The Fangirl, that the beldam could be the yokai of Japanese folklore Jorogumo. Put simply, this is a type of spirit whose base form is a spider but possesses the ability to shapeshift into a woman in order to seduce or entice their prey. Their prey, of course, primarily comprising of humans, and according to legends, they've been known to use abandoned shacks as their home base. Now, of course, this isn't a perfect comparison. Jorogumo are primarily known to be seductresses of young men, which implies a much more sexual connotation than what the beldam was doing. Furthermore, this yokai is much more like a literal spider, imprisoning their prey with spider silk and then draining them of their life with their deadly venom. Not to mention that, along with these differences, Coraline seemed to have been conceptualized primarily with more Western influences. For example, Gaiman based the original setting on much of his own childhood in East Grinstead in England. Although, as we learned from our Over the Garden Wall video from a couple years ago, this is a pretty deep rabbit hole and there are likely way more creatures that the beldam could be borrowing traits from. After all, murdering and eating little children seems to be one of the only consistent through lines with most mythological creatures. So between the similarities and differences between the beldam and Pennywise, Maturin and the cat, the dark fantasy tropes, and the fact that the beldam could be a host of other creatures, where have we landed? Is Pennywise the same species as the beldam? Well, it's definitely still possible. Even if there are differences between the two, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're completely different creatures. Actual spiders differ wildly from each other, whether they're predatory or venomous or huge and disgusting or emo, so the avenue is definitely still there. But there's also the matter that these two creatures do possess some fairly common elements of dark fantasy monsters. And there are plenty of other beasts that you could probably assign the beldam to like we did today. But personally, I can't resist a good cross-universe theory, and this is a good one. So with that in mind, on the plausibility meter, I'm going to have to rate the conspiracy of the beldam from Coraline being the same species as Pennywise from It 3.5 cats voiced by Keith David out of 5. Yes, the voice is an important factor because Keith David has the best voice in the world. But what do you think? Do you think that Coraline and It share a connection through their monsters? Do you have any other guesses as to what the beldam could be? And through both scares and laughs, which version of Pennywise do you prefer? Tim Curry's 1990 clown or Bill Skarsgård's 2017 version? I can't really pick a favorite, but if I had to choose, I mean, Tim Curry always makes me laugh in the original film adaptation. Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments, don't forget to like this video, and if this is your first time here, subscribe to Channel Frederator for all sorts of awesome videos. And of course, don't forget to ring that little bell icon to become part of our notification squad. And of course, before we go, one last thing, never forget, Frederator loves you.